Hello everybody. Today I want to show you another workflow that will allow you to hand place your assets in an artistic way, but still use the power of PCG to procedurally spawn hundreds or thousands of instances and randomize each of them individually to achieve better realism and complexity in your world. You can do it with any kind of objects, even with full buildings, like you can see here. And I'm spawning this whole town using only these 4 buildings. So let's start. First, let's see how we can create a level instance from our objects and how we can reuse it. So as you can see here, I spent some amount of time. You can probably guess it's a lot to arrange these objects, and in this particular case you would be wrong, because I want to show you a simple trick if you want to achieve something like this. So for example, I can select a couple of the objects that we have here. So let's say these ones, and I'll just copy them. So if you have objects that you want to place naturally, you can use the engine's physics simulation, so it will do it for you. So select the objects in your scene, click this simulate physics in the details panel, so you can search for physics and click this simulate physics checkbox. Then instead of running the game, just hit this simulate button. If you don't have it, it will be in the drop down. So just click the simulate, and you'll see that the object will fall in your scene. They will respect the physics setup that you have for each of the objects, so the collision and so on. And after you're happy with the placement of the objects, or after they stopped moving, you must press the K key, because if I don't press it and hit stop, you'll see that the objects are now back where they started. So let's hit simulate again. The object will simulate their position. I'll hit the K key, and this will save the positions. I'll then stop the simulation and uncheck the simulate physics. So now all my objects are placed how I want them, so they have a natural feel to their placement. I'll delete this one because I don't like it being upside down. It takes too much of the visual interest of this arrangement. So I want to have all of these objects together in a simple level that I can place anywhere I want to in the world. So what I will do is I'll select everything, and you can use the Control Alt keys and then drag into the level to select objects. And in this case, you'll see that I selected also the landscape, and if I go to the other side, you'll see that some of the objects are not selected, like this tire, for example, or these tires. So the engine doesn't do a really great job if you do this in the lit mode. But if you change to the wireframe mode, and you can see what I talked before. So here you can see it's not selecting this, but so in the wireframe mode, if I Control Alt and drag and select all of the objects, you'll see that I now selected every object, so except these ones that I cannot see at all from the other side. So let's Control Alt Shift and drag again, and this will add these objects. Maybe Control Alt Shift again for this one. So okay, now I have all the objects selected. Let's try to change back to the lit mode. And it seems that I have something selected that prevents me from dragging them. So this is the landscape proxy. So let's unselect this. And now let's try to move them. Okay, So I have everything except this object right here. Where is it? Okay. Let's go back to the wireframe mode and select it. Okay. So now that I have everything selected, I can right click and browse here to the level submenu, then create a level instance from these objects. And this will ask you where should be the pivot of this level, newly created level instance. I'll choose the center option, and this will create my level instance pivot in the center. And I'll deliberately choose this in order to show you a couple of things later with our PCG. So it's important to know where your pivot is. It's important to know how to manipulate it. So let's right now choose the center and let's click OK. And this will ask you where to save this level. I'll save it in this assemblies folder and call this junk, for example. So you will see that it creates a new level into our folder, and everywhere that I drag this, it will place this junk mesh, this entire level. And what you saw in the beginning, so let's drag it again, is that because of my pivot is in the center, it will place most of the objects underground, so it's in the center of the objects, and the ones that are below the center are going underground, and we don't want this. So because of that, I'll move the object how I want it to be positioned. Then I'll click the Control E key, and this is E for edit, so Control E, and you'll see that we are entering an edit mode just for this level that we have created. And now you'll see here into your outliner, it will create this pivot object for your level. And this is where the pivot is located when you drag the level in your scene. So if I move this a little bit down, and let's do it like this, for example. So let's use the left camera, then click the F key to focus here. So it's a little bit too low right now, so I'll move it right here where all the bottom parts of my objects are located, and the objects that are currently in the level are this purple color. So let's go back to the lit mode and to the perspective camera. Now I'll click the save button, and this will change my level, and it will move every instance of the level based on this new pivot. And I'll delete those and just drag a new instance into my level, and you'll see that it's perfectly placed. So great, but how to use this with PCG? So in order to use this with PCG, you need to generate another special asset. This you can do by right-clicking on the level, then going to Asset Actions and create PCG asset from level. So right-click, Asset Actions, create PCG asset from level, and I'll call it junk PCG, and I'll put it into the PCG assets folder. So let's save this. And now let's create a new PCG graph in order to see how to use this. So let's create an empty graph. I'll call it junk graph. Let's place it here into our level. I'll move it a little bit to the right so it doesn't intersect with these houses. We'll look at the houses later, but for now, let's look at this junk graph. So let's open the graph and let's, for example, do a surface sampler, and let's sample our landscape. We'll sample our landscape. Let's connect the debug node, and you'll see that these are the points that we are generating. It's a little bit too dense, so let's put 0.05, something like this. And now instead of using a static mesh spawner like usual, so if you want to place a static mesh, you do a static mesh spawner, then create a mesh entry, and here into the descriptor we'll use some static mesh. For example, let's say this one. Right now, after it's done compiling the materials, you'll see it will place a static mesh into our level. And as I showed you before, you can create a parameter. So let's create a parameter. Let's call it, let's rename this to mesh. Let's change the type to static mesh. And let's select this same object as a default value. And right now, if I click here and get my mesh parameter, I can add an attribute to my data, and this attribute will be this mesh value. And now, instead of setting up my mesh entry like array directly into the static mesh spawner, I can set it with an selector by attribute, and the attribute will be mesh, because we'll name this attribute right here mesh. Okay, so if I have into my data, so let's inspect our data by clicking the A key on this add attribute and selecting our graph here. If we look at our data, you'll see that here at the end into the mesh field, we have a link to our parameter, which is currently this barrel. And if we change this barrel, for example, to this object, and you'll see that it changes into the level. And if you have multiple objects, as you remember from before, sorry to show you things that you already have seen in the previous tutorial, but it's important to understand them in order to understand how we'll use the packed level that we just created. So if we create a match and set, so let's do match and set attributes, and the match data will be our parameter, and let's change the parameter to an array type, and let's connect a couple of different objects. So let's do these two. So now we'll have two objects. Let's inspect our match and set attribute. So here at the end, you'll see we have this mesh value, and let's expand it a bit. And this mesh value is randomly choosing one of our two meshes. So if we connect it now to our static mesh spawner, because our static mesh spawner is looking into each point mesh attribute, it's finding a different value for each of them, and that's why it's spawning a different mesh right here. So something similar will happen with our level. So in order to work with our level, let's remove this nodes and right click and load PCG data asset. If you write PCG, you'll see this load PCG data asset, and we need to load the data asset that we generated earlier. So it's in our PCG assets folder, this junk PCG. So let's select here from our drop down the junk PCG, and here into the points output of this node, if I click the A key on this node, you'll see that it has two outputs, the root output and the points output. And for the points output, you see that it has a mesh variable for each point, which contains the mesh that it's placed into our level on this exact point. So it will generate a point for each object in your scene, and it will create a mesh variable associated with the static mesh that you used in this level. So let's copy this entire level of points for each point of our surface sampler. So let's copy points, and these points will be the target, the ones that we are sampling from our landscape, and the ones that we copy are all the points from our level. And now if we connect to the static mesh spawner, and remember that this static mesh spawner is using the mesh selector by attribute, and the attribute is mesh, because this is how our attribute is called into the Vault data PCG asset node. So let's connect this to our static mesh spawner, and you'll see that it places our level on each point that we created. But what you will see is that it will not respect this pivot actor that we edited earlier. It will use the original pivot that you created for the level. This is a problem because the original pivot was wrong. We created it at the center. So how can we fix this? So let's go back to our level, this junk level. So if I place it works right because it uses this pivot actor, but it will not work right with our PCG. So the way to fix this, and this is exactly why I did it this way, so you know how to fix the problem, is to open this level. So I first saved every change that we created in our previous level, and now I'm opening this junk level. And because this level does not contain any light so we can see our objects, let's change the mode to unlit, and now you can see all the objects. And if I now change my camera to the left camera, let's select all the objects that we have. Let's click the F key to focus, and let's change to wireframe mode. And you'll see that we can move all the objects together, and we need to move them in a way that they will be at the 0, 0, 0 point of our level. So let's add a new object to this level. Let's add, for example, a plane. And this plane, let's move it at 0, 0, 0 in our level. So the plane is right here. It's a little bit hard to see. So this is our plane. So let's scale it so it's easier to see. Okay. So this is our 0 mark for the z-axis. So let's select all the objects except this plane. Let's move them up so they sit entirely on this plane, and I'll disable the snapping for now and move the objects that are a little bit over the ground. I'll move them like this. So something like this seems fine to me. Okay. So right now I just need to delete the plane that I created. So this plane, I don't need it. And let's save everything by file, save all. And now let's go back to the previous level that I have opened. So in this case, it's my untitled level. So right now, if I go back to lit mode, let's delete this object and let's look at our PCG. You'll see that nothing has happened. And this is because we did a change into our level, but the actual PCG asset, this junk PCG, is not updated. So our level is updated, and if I place it in the level, it will actually look like it's not okay, because we have this additional pivot actor for manually placing the level, and we moved everything so it's not lined up with this additional actor anymore. But we can fix this as well by clicking Ctrl E, then selecting this pivot, going into wireframe, left, focus everything, and move this pivot right here. Then save this level, go into a perspective, lit mode, and now everything is fine even when placing the level in the viewport. But it's still not fine for our PCG. And this is because our PCG graph that we just created, so this junk graph, it's using the PCG asset instead of the level. So if we go to the PCG asset, right click on this PCG asset that we created for the level, asset actions, and then update PCG asset. This will update the PCG asset with the new level that we created. And you will see that now all the PCG assets are placed on the ground exactly like we would expect to. So it's a little bit too dense right now, so let's reduce our sampler to something like this. And now all of them are oriented the same way, so it's a little bit not realistic. You can see the pattern very easily. So before we copy the points, let's do a transform points, and I'll rotate the points so it's a little bit more realistic how we place all these objects. So another thing that you can do, so first let's get rid of this overlapping object. So let's create a debug to see our surface points. So let's create our extents to be bigger so they cover the full area. So let's do 100, 100, maybe 200, 200, maybe 250, something like this. And then I'll reduce the points per square meter because they're too uniform right now. And right now I'll do a self-pruning. So we don't have any overlapping objects. Let's do again a little bit denser. So right now I should not have any overlapping objects. So I have too little objects after the self-pruning. Probably this area is too big. Let's do 200 by 200. So I think this should be fine. Okay, so let's remove the debug. So now that we have placed these objects, what else you can do to improve this feeling of realism? Because now every object that we have here looks exactly the same. So if we go back into our level, the level that we created, this junk level, let's click, put it in our scene. Let's click Control E to edit our level. So right now we can go into this level and we can select different objects and give them a tag. For example, let's select this, anything that's on the ground. So I'm Control Shift clicking on objects that are not supporting other objects, because I'll make some randomization of the placement, but I don't want to, for example, randomly place this tire on the bottom, because if it doesn't exist, these top ones will not look right. So I'm just selecting objects that we can conditionally place, and still our scene should look fine. For example, this and this and this. So when you have this should be fine too. So when you have selected enough objects that you feel it will add to the realism of your scene, then search for tag here into the details panel, and into the actor section click on the plus sign and give them a tag. For example, I'll add a quarter tag, because this object will be used like a randomly cluttering our scene. So let's save our level. And as you remember, in order to apply our changes to the PCG graph, we need to go into the PCG asset that we created, this junk PCG, and update our PCG asset. Okay, so now we have this level having tag clutter for all the objects that we want to procedurally randomly place into our scene. So let's go back to our PCG graph, this junk graph, and here, after we copy the points, we'll do an attribute filter. Yeah. So, and we'll filter all the objects that have this clutter set to true. So select equal, target attribute will be clutter, use constant threshold, and the threshold will be of a type boolean, and the boolean will be true. So now these are all the objects that are having this tag clutter. So I'll do some manipulation to them, but all the other objects that don't have a tag clutter, so outside the filter, I'll directly connect them to the static mesh spawner, so we'll always spawn them. But for the ones with the tag clutter, I'll do a random choice. I'll uncheck this fixed mode and I'll leave the ratio to 0.5. So I'll randomly choose 50% of the objects. And I'll spawn only 50% of each of these objects into our scene. So for example, here you can see that in this instance of the level, I don't have any of these corrugated metal sheets, but here I have both sheets, but here I have only one sheet. And here, for example, I don't have this wooden panel. So every instance of the level looks a little bit different. And what you can also do is, for example, randomize the position of these objects. So in this case, it will not work very well, because if I randomize the position of these metal sheets, they will probably not look very realistically placed into our scene. But just to give you an example, I'll do a transform points, and I'll connect these transform points to the static mesh spawner. And let's say I'll randomly move them 50 units in all directions, and let's regenerate our graph, because sometimes when it's spawning levels, it has problem when you update the values. So just force regenerate from time to time. So hold the control key and force regenerate your PCG graph. And okay, now you'll see that we have a little bit of a problem with the placement, because we randomly change the position of each object and we have them specifically placed to look good without the randomization. So this is just an example what you can do, but in this case we will not do it. But if we go back to not randomizing the position, maybe you want to randomize the scale, just as an example. So let's save this, let's regenerate. Now you'll see that in some instances this palette is huge, in some instances it's small, and same it's for other clutter objects. So you have these huge tires next to the regular ones and so on. So you have the control what you do with the points that you select with this tag. And what is even better is that this will work for objects in another level instance. So for example, I have these buildings created as level instances. So let's remove this and go back like this. So I have this graph created that will use 4 of these houses, so 4 different level instances, and it will create this city. And what you can see here is, for example, if I go into this house and let's click Ctrl E to edit the level instance, and then place, for example, this junk on top of the building. So let's save this. Let's go into my PCG asset, and right now you'll see that nothing is updated here. This two-story building doesn't have this on the roof. But if I go here into the medium building and asset action, update PCG assets, and let's regenerate the graph to be sure everything is fine. So let's open the spawn building graph. When we are spawning our buildings, I'm filtering, I'm getting the data into 4 different sets, and for each set I'm using a different level for each house that I created. So here, after I get the data for all of the houses, let's say that I'll do a attribute filter like we did before, and outside the filter I'll spawn normally everything, and inside the filter I'll have everything that has a value of quarter, which is a boolean value of true. Now I'll select just half of those, so random choice, and I'll use half of those and spawn them. Let's save everything and rebuild this graph. So you can see that I have this quarter tag working fine for my level with this junk. So for example, here you can see this. I have this metal part, but here I don't have it. Here I don't have the wooden panel and so on. And for the barrels, some of the barrels have this fallen barrel next to them. Some of them don't have it. And some of them have on top of the stack another barrel and some don't. So it works for different levels inside this level. So this level has quarter tag for the vegetation near the border of the building, and the sub levels, as you saw, have this tag, so it will work for all the levels nested inside. And this is great because you can have different tags for objects that you want to manipulate specifically in PCG, and you can combine no matter how levels you want inside each other, and the PCG will place everything procedurally and other randomization, and it will look very natural because you hand placed everything exactly like you want. You just add some randomization with PCG. And I think this is a great workflow that will allow you to add quickly huge areas of your level to be filled with different kind of objects that have randomized look to them, but they're very artistically placed, like you can see here, for example. It's not just randomizing position of objects, they are stacked nicely onto each other, so they look realistic. So if you want to see how this town is generated, I can create another video, but I'll show you an overview of the graph. So first we sample our landscape, then we randomly rotate some of the points just 5 degrees in order to have some buildings like you can see here that are not completely aligned to each other. Then we are adding a random rotation with 90 degrees for all of the buildings, so they're not all will wind up to each other looking the same way. So you can see that some buildings are rotated 90 degrees, some 180, and so on. So you have randomization of the buildings. And then we generate some points. Like for example, here we select some of the points in order to use them. Here, the squares we are using later to remove from our data, so we can create these areas where we don't have buildings. And after this, we just select some amount of our points and add them a type attribute for the type of the building that we want: small 1, small 2, medium 1, and medium 2. And then we self-prune everything so we don't have overlapping buildings like I showed you earlier with our junk graph. Then we do the difference with the squares that we generated here. So let's debug these squares. So these are the points, and if I disable this difference, you'll see that my town will have buildings everywhere, but if I enable them, it will create some areas where I don't have buildings. Then I'm using this normal to density and density filter. If I disable it, you'll see that I'll get some buildings that are on surfaces that are not horizontal, so this should not have a house on it. That's why I'm using a density filter to remove those. Then I'm discarding points on irregular surface. So if I have a surface that's flat, but not flat enough to the full surface, so it cannot contain a full house, I'm disregarding this point, and I'm not sure if this node in this case, because this fairly flat area, does something, but it's nice to have it because you can have this graph used on areas that are not so flat. And then I'm partitioning the graph based on the type attribute, so I have type small 1, small 2, medium 1, and medium 2. And then I'm using this subgraph for each of the 4 sets. I'm getting the first set, and I'm copying the points of the different building with the walled PCG asset graph. So exactly like I showed you for the junk graph, it's just having some additional logic to place the buildings with the rotation and on the flat surface. So that's everything. And here I have another graph for this bazaar area. So everything is very easy to create. I have this graph for the additional detail on the ground as well. But in the next tutorials, I'll show you some more concepts related to these graphs. And guys, if you like the tutorial, like the video, you can subscribe for the channel. If you join the channel, you can watch the videos 1 week earlier than anybody else and ask your questions, get your answers earlier, so you can continue with your game development. And hope you like this video, and I'll see you in the next tutorial. Bye.